Hi, my name is Umberto Castaneda, and it's way past your Berto time. It literally is tonight. It's very late for me, but I had to do this one. So today I'm going to talk about free will. Free will is something that I've talked about in some other podcasts, and it's come up. I've even had a couple discussions about it on the YouTube comments. It is a fascinating topic, and I just wanted to touch on it. I'm not the first commentator. In fact, free will has been a topic of conversation going back thousands of years. So I'm certainly late to the party. And I will say that most of my ideas about it are not new. I just I have found that the way I think about it has already been represented out there by folks like Sam Harris and a few others. But that's okay. I want to talk about it. So first off, I want to start with some definitions. What is free will? Well, see, that's a circular question because that's what we're trying to figure out. If we had a really good definition, maybe we could determine once and for all if we have it or if we don't. And I think that there's different perceptions about what free will might be. Sometimes people think of it as, I can do what I want, like Cartman in South Park. You know, is it the ability to be able to make a decision moment to moment in your life? Is it the ability to choose a path that you're going to go down, the road in the woods when they diverge? Is it about which college you're going to go to or what class you're going to take, who you're going to date, what are you going to say on the date, what are you going to order at dinner, how much you're going to eat of the food that's in front of you at dinner, how early you're going to go to bed, what YouTube video you want to watch, how long do you want to watch the YouTube video, are you going to give it a like, are you going to subscribe? All these questions and more. Are these all free will? So let's make a couple of attempts at a definition. Because we are humans, we are human-centric. I think one definition would be the ability for a human to make a choice independent of other humans. So that's interesting. This doesn't try to tackle the question of like, where is your brain doing the thinking, or is there a little soul inside of you, or what are the actual quantum processes happening? None of that. We're simply saying, look, if you are able to make a decision without other humans influencing it, then maybe that's free will. Now, I think we'll find that even that's hard. It's hard, meaning even that is a hard standard to validate. Let's take it for a test drive. So imagine that you are a human and you are born into human world, right? So when you're born, you're already exposed to some humans. Even if you are taken to an orphanage right off the bat, you're still exposed to other humans because there's humans at the orphanage. There's people, doctors, nurses, people that take care of you. There's the other orphans there, and these are worst case scenarios. Normally you'll have parents, you'll have uncles, relatives. These are humans that start influencing your mind. And then as soon as you're able to start watching television or reading books, you have other humans influencing your mind. So then all these little influences start accumulating one on top of the other. And they start forming the foundations in your head about what makes you you and what determines what you're going to decide at any given moment. So now we're starting to get already in the weeds about like, wait a minute, how much of those influences really come into play when you're trying to make a decision? But it's just hard. It's a hard claim to make that your parents, the things you see other adults do, the things you see other kids do, don't influence you. At least don't influence you at all in any cases. That would be a really hard claim to make. Not to mention, all the burden of proof would be on your side about how did the child even learn how to walk, how to talk. You would have to prove that those behaviors are actually already in the genes and that the brain connections end up forming without the observations taking place. And of course, you're not going to be able to, spoiler alert, but even if you could somehow get some PhDs in genetics, and then it turns out you find the genes that teach humans how to walk. Okay, well, certainly there's a limit, right? Like not everyone knows how to play piano, right? And how did you learn how to play piano? Well, you'll say, well, I just looked at the page and I practiced. It's like someone told you what to do, or you watched people doing it. You are watching humans. Now, it's not just humans, granted. You do watch natural processes. You watch animals. You watch the sun. You watch, things fall, of course. But most of your human behaviors, and the advanced ones at least, are the result of you watching other humans. Well, so assuming we're far along, we're coming along for the ride so far, and we agree, because if we can't agree that a human is influenced by other humans and that influence affects their behavior, if we can't agree on that, we're going to have trouble here, because we have to go, again, we're going to have to prove a lot of things happen just genetically. And by the way, if we prove that they happen genetically, now you have a whole different problem regarding free will, because you're going to have to explain to me how it is free will if it was determined by your genes that your neurons would wire up in just the right way to produce your piano playing behavior. Again, you're either going to have to prove like this big genetic factor for everything, right? And then once you do, you're going to have to then somehow back out and explain that the genetics only carry to a certain point, and then there is still room for your neurons to act with free will. And we'll get to that part of it. But you see, you get yourself into a bit of a problem. Not to mention, like, that those proofs don't exist. So we got to go with the signs we know, the evidence we have so far. Now, you could make an argument at this point and say, well, wait a minute. You're doing an all or nothing argument. Like, because so many behaviors seem to be, affected by the humans around us, now did that mean that we had no free will in every behavior? And that's a fair point. So let's look at that for a second. So again, we're going with this basic definition, which is just one, we're just exploring it. Free will is when a human is able to make a decision without the influence of other humans. Okay. All right. Well, we've so far said, and maybe you've agreed, maybe you haven't, but so far we've said that there seems to be a vast number of human behaviors that you don't learn automatically just because you woke up one day as a human, that you learn because of society, because of watching other humans, and through a lot of practice and interaction with humans in many cases. If you again still don't agree with that, we're going to have to go. We have a lot of work ahead of us. But assuming you do, or at least you're following along, now there's this question. Well, fine. Let's say 99.99999% of the behaviors are absorbed from humans. And by the way, let's put a pause on the question of whether there's still room for free will at that point. Let's just put a pause on that. Let's just say that any behaviors that you've learned from other humans, those patterns are now no longer available for your free will determinations, because you're just running the programs. You're just pressing execute. And you could say, well, wait, who pressed execute? Isn't that the free will? And I'll say, like, okay, let's put that one on pause too. Let's say, fine, maybe that's where the free will is hiding. But let's at least agree that once the program is running, you're executing based on things that were influenced by the humans. So you're not really exactly acting on free will. But again, we didn't prove that it was all the behavior. So let's say that we are reserving some little piece of the pie to say there's some things you weren't influenced by other humans. What could that be? Well, let's say that it's something, you encounter something no human has ever encountered. Let's play a little mind game right now. Let's imagine that you're walking through a forest, and all of a sudden, out of the ground comes a creature that no human has seen before, and it's only visible in the ultraviolet spectrum, and something happens to your eyes where now you can see it in the ultraviolet spectrum. So no human has directly or even close to having had this experience before. And now you react in some way to that creature. So it might be tempting to say, well, in that moment, some aspects of your reaction might have been free will. You couldn't have modeled all the aspects of that reaction necessarily from another human, because no human had experienced that. So maybe some aspects of that reaction were brand new, completely free will. Okay, perhaps. Now, we are presupposing that your reaction to the particulars of that new thing was unique. Each time that you encounter something different enough, your reaction patterns are unique to that new thing. And that's a big assumption, because what usually happens, first of all, in the initial shock, you don't have a chance for your conscious brain to like process what's going on. Usually there's some autonomic functions that take over. You might, certain hormones might be released. Your pulse might quicken. You might naturally back up. Your breath, you might hold your breath. You might freeze. All these types of reactions, they're not something that you processed and said, oh, you know what, I'm going to freeze for a bit and hold my breath. This just happens before you're even aware. But then, what happens as soon as your conscious brain starts kicking in? Well, your brain's already going like, whoa, what is this? Is this going to hurt me? And then you're connecting the dots. It looks like, it sounds like, what should I do? Should I run away? But none of that is necessarily unique. You could imagine that same reaction happened when someone ran into a bear, or when someone ran into a shark, or whatever, like very similar reactions. And a lot of them actually might, in this case, be genetic, at least those first initial reactions. And then as soon as you start putting two and two together, so to speak, you're just building on what you know. You're saying, well, and this is really quick, and it's sort of like half verbally in your brain. You're going, hey, it looks like a monster, or it looks like a bear. I wonder, all these things are happening. But again, it's a hard claim to make, to say that in that moment, you are producing a net new free will decision. Even in the moment where you finally say, I think I'm going to run. Well, you probably learned, through a combination of genetics and observing, that like running away from something scary is not a bad idea. Because as you were learning to walk and daddy or mommy were like pretending to be a ghost, you learned that like if you ran back towards your room, that was pretty good. So you're kind of acting on that. All right, so now we're getting into the weeds a little bit, and it's getting a little difficult to talk about this without talking about the brain and what might be going on in the brain. So this definition that free will is something that when you make a decision that wasn't influenced by other humans, it gets really hard to prove or to even follow along with it pretty quickly. Because it's hard to determine how much you've seen, how much you've experienced. We can make generalizations, and like I said, in some extreme examples, like, how you learn to play the violin, it's really hard to make a claim that, yeah, that was all free will, that there was no observing of other humans and then copying them. Now, at this point, you may also poke a hole at even this whole line, which is to say, wait a minute. Just because you're copying someone doesn't mean that the decision to copy them wasn't your own. And this is that moment that we identified a little bit ago, where we said, well, what was deciding which program to run? Who is the decider? So let's assume that you have 100 programs in your brain, and once those programs are running, you're on autopilot. You're just, executing what you've already known. You're not really making a free will decision. But who decides which program to run in each moment? Okay, so maybe that's what we should be focusing on. And again, we could still try to stick to our definition and say, all right, well, let's see. If you choose which program to run, but you make that choice without other humans influencing it, maybe that's free will. Okay, so we'll examine that. But before we examine that, we should identify at this point that we're being really artificial about this idea that it's got to be if other humans didn't influence you. Because, and what about the example in the forest where it wasn't a human at all that showed up? Or what about when like a coconut falls on your head and you don't have time to imitate a specific human? Your muscles react autonomically to it and things like that. So again, there's things that just nature influences you, affects your body. Maybe it's an animal, maybe it's the wind, maybe it's a coconut, whatever it is. And then at that point, what programs you might run in response may be copies of things you learned from watching humans. Some might just be genetically determined programs, like, flinch reactions or sweat or all these types of things. So are there some hiding in there that are truly of your own volition? Okay, so this is where I think we have to leave this definition aside and try a new definition, because we're now in the brain and we're like trying to decide who's executing these programs. And that's where we have to try something else. So let's give a new definition a go and see. Let's say we think of free will as when the conscious voice inside your head, and I think we're all familiar with that little conscious voice that says, I think I will have dessert today. And sometimes it's really verbal, like you can basically hear the voice, and sometimes it's the idea of it, but it's still sort of a voice in your head. Where that conscious voice, so not the autonomic response, but the conscious voice makes a determination. And because it can make a determination, that's free will. In other words, you're sitting there in your brain and you're kind of hearing your inner theater play out. A person walks up to you and says hello. And now you have a decision to make. And that little voice, again, sometimes verbally, sometimes a little more implicitly, says, let's say hello. You say hello. You made a decision. So that seems like free will. So maybe that's the key, is that when that inner voice inside your head runs a program, makes a decision, that's free will. Okay? It sounds pretty good, right? Because like it does feel like that's what's happening to some extent, right? Like meaning, for example, right now, I just decided I'm going to pick up the little Canon lid to my camera. You didn't tell me to do it. No other human was here telling me to do it. I literally just looked down. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to pick up that lid. It was a totally free will decision in my head, right? Like my little voice said, pick up the lid. You are free to pick up the lid. So if we stop there and we just kind of de facto agree that that's free will, that's a fine definition. Meaning we've just defined it a certain way. We've said, listen, if the little voice inside your head decides to do something, by definition, that is free will. And since, in fact, that's what happened, my little voice did that. And all we need is one example of this. We don't need 1,000. We don't need infinite. We need one example. If at least one time in the entirety of existence of human beings, of the universe, if at least one time one of us beings made one of these decisions from that little voice in the head, then we have met the definition and free will at least exists. So keep in mind, that's different from saying free will exists all the time or everyone's always exercising free will. We're just saying that it exists. That's like that minimum bar. Okay, so again, notice what we're doing. We're not now proving that all definitions of free will are real, right? We've defined it very specifically. I've said, if my little voice in my head makes the decision consciously to pick up the thing, then I've had free will. There's lots of holes to poke at this. I just said, if the little voice inside my head, but I already even caveated that sometimes it's not a voice, sometimes it's not verbal. So it's a very, like I'm hand waving here. I'm saying the little voice. What little voice? Okay, so in this case, if it was a voice, I didn't hear it. There was no audio, no air vibrations. So it was definitely just synapses firing in my brain, amounting to the simulation of a voice. But actually, it was too quick for me to inside my head hear a voice. It's not like when I'm reading and I can sort of hear the voice reading. It's not like that. I looked down and the decision was split. So I was like, I'm going to pick up that thing. And actually, I didn't even say the words, I'm going to pick up that thing in my head. The concept of me picking up that lid happened. So it definitely wasn't a voice. Now, sometimes it does sound like a voice, like, I'm going to go and blah, blah, blah. But it's definitely not all the time like that. And a lot of times it's too quick to notice. So if we can't just call it a voice, what is it? A determination was made. Okay, so maybe if we think of this in terms of triggers, data was flowing around in my head and an accumulation of inputs all of a sudden triggered a decision to pick up this lid. And it seems to be a meta controller of my actions that are very conscious. It seems to be. What I mean by that is, whether it's quote unquote free will or not, I definitely have, look right now, so I'm holding this pencil. I am going to shake it back and forth. This is a very conscious decision I made. This wasn't an autonomic response to fear. It wasn't me like having an involuntary spasm. I said I was going to do it, and then I sent little signals to my arm muscles, and now it's happening. Very conscious. This kind of thing is clearly an overseer, a controller, if you will, that is able to trigger conscious programs into action. Maybe it's my superego, right? Maybe it's, but there's something there. So let's give that a name. I'm going to call it the voice inside my head. That's just the name I'm going to give it. But it is the meta controller executing conscious programs. Okay, so now we've defined voice inside my head. Have we defined it well enough? Okay, well, I just said it's a controller executing conscious programs. Okay, what is a conscious program? Why was this a conscious decision? Why wasn't it a conscious decision if it was an involuntary twitch or a fear reaction? What's the difference? This is tricky, right? So I think part of this really has to do with the speed at which we, the person we are, can process what's happening. So there is someone who we, each of us, are. I am Umberto. And the experience of being me is such that, I live within 1 to 3 seconds of reality. And I don't live in my past. I don't live in my future. I live right now. And right now, I am aware that I am Umberto. I am aware, I feel a myriad of memories that make me me. Like I know where I'm from and my family and I can quickly, instantly recall parents and cousins and family and places and foods and things. And they're not always consciously floating in front of my eyes, but they're there. I can sense that they're there. I have a sense of who I am, moment to moment. Okay, so that's who I am. It's me and these conscious memories, plus some feelings about my body. I have certain feelings about my body. And like, I know where I know I'm in a specific location. And all these things sort of like add up to Umberto, the experience of being Umberto. And it's the experience of being Umberto that is not super quick. We don't think very quickly. Not compared to a computer running math operations, or even compared to a lot of our autonomic responses. This is why you can get punched in the face before you're aware. This is why sometimes you crash and you don't even know what happened. Because your body will react, certain parts of your body will react quicker than your conscious part of your mind is aware of it. You can do this. There's all sorts of experiments you could do with this. The famous, when the doctor hits your right at the knee to trigger a response. I forget what it's called, but like that is an autonomic response that your conscious brain doesn't have time to decide on. Similarly, the fear response. If someone shocks you, you're walking, someone comes around the corner, your body goes like this. That was not a aware, conscious decision. But it was still something your brain triggered, right? So it could still be in the realm of discussion for was that free will or not. But we know that we instinctually can feel that difference between things that just seem to happen before we are able to decide if they should or shouldn't happen, and things we decide. I mean, at the very least, we are certainly aware that sometimes things are completely outside of our body's control. If I am walking and a coconut falls on my head, not only was I not able to react consciously to the coconut, but I certainly didn't trigger the coconut, most likely, right? So the world influences us way before we are able to determine if that's something we want to have happen or not. And once the world influences us, often we don't have time to consciously process what has happened before already our muscles have done something, our heart has done something. And sometimes parts of our brain haven't even been able to react, or parts of our nervous system. So certainly you might get burnt before you even move your arm away. And even when you moved your arm away, that was even before you were consciously aware of being burnt. So the physical world already affected you before even the autonomic response was able to happen. And the autonomic response happened before the conscious part was able to realize, I'm getting burnt. So that's really interesting. So sticking with the conscious response, which is the slower processing unit, the one that basically is not able to react to the scare, but is able to say, why did you do that? Right? That's the one that's making these little programs execute with apparent free will. This is now where we get into, but what triggers the triggerer? In other words, who watches the watchman, right? So, okay, let's say we now have this definition of the little voice inside my head is that controller that triggers these programs. But what made it trigger a specific program? This is the question. This is what it all boils down to. And we now have to go deeper for a definition of free will, because otherwise we're just in a circular reference. Again, perfectly fine to define it that way. And we could even stop there. As humans, we could go on with our life and say, because to me it feels like I'm able to make these conscious decisions, I have free will. I have practical free will as I've defined it. No problem. But the catch is that not everyone means that when they say free will. In fact, I would argue that probably the intuitive feeling we have when we say free will goes deeper than that. That what we actually are saying is that we are free in some universal and probably in some cases some holy way. What I mean by that is, because see, as soon as I say, okay, well, if the voice inside my head triggered the programs, that means I exercise free will. But then if I get all neuron about it and chemical reaction about it, I can start now dissecting that and saying, well, wait a minute. Why did I consciously decide to pick up this? Well, first of all, I certainly didn't have an infinite number of things I could have picked up, because there are not infinite things right here in my room for me to pick up. Number one. Number two. So we've already agreed, we must agree that there's a finite number of things I could pick up. Because partially, I'm not aware when I pick up an atom, for example, a molecule. We're always doing it. We're grabbing molecules and atoms, but we're not aware of that. So I can't decide to do that. So it would have to be something that is at the scale of a human, the scale that I can see, touch, those kinds of things. And I don't have an infinite number of those here. Even molecules certainly don't have an infinite, but I definitely don't have an infinite supply. I have a finite supply. Not only do I have a finite supply, I have a very finite supply, because I also can't just pick up anything. I couldn't have picked up my desk with one hand and showed it to you. I don't have that capability within our physical limitations. So now you could say, well, I could have done more than pick up, right? Like I could have drawn on the thing. I guess, yeah, but even then we'll see that my choices of what I could do to interact with my environment were limited physically. They were limited in the number of objects that are interactable with. They were limited in the types of actions I can do. For example, I don't have flame powers or force powers. I wish I did, but I don't. So I couldn't have levitated the lid. I couldn't have burnt it. I couldn't have frozen it. I had a limited number of things I could have done with this pencil, with the lid, and so forth. So again, we're not yet in my brain. We're just already realizing that we are physically limited in the number of options. But you say, that's okay. All you need is 2 options in order for free will to exist. Okay, let's go along with that. Let's say, fine. Even if I only had 2 options, 50-50, that's all I need for free will. Okay, let's go with that. All right, let's say that my only 2 options, period, were to pick up this lid or to not pick up this lid. Pick up this lid and show you, or not pick up this lid and show you. Those are my only two options. And let's even say it was a 50-50 chance, completely even odds. Okay. So why did I pick it up? So now we have some options here as to why. One option is that it was completely random, meaning some random thing, some dice is rolled in my brain, and whatever the random result of that dice roll is what determines whether I pick up this lid. If we go with that approach, that's going to be a hard one to reconcile with the idea of free will. Because what we're basically saying is that me picking up the lid and we're extrapolating to all my actions are always the result of dice being rolled, metaphoric dice, some quantum or other reaction, and some truly random output determining what happens. If that's the case and it's truly random, then I didn't make a choice. The universe's random computation came out randomly to some decision. There was no decision by me, by Umberto. As if we go with that angle. But that's not the only angle we could take. We could say, well, it's not really that it's 50-50. It's just that those are the only two options. But I calculated as a result of my unique brain configuration that I wanted to pick it up. It wasn't random. It was the result of my unique brain configuration. Okay, now if we go with this angle, sounds starting to sound a little less constrictive than the random number generator. But if we go with this angle, now what we're saying is that it's all up to my brain configuration. Well, let's dissect that a little bit. What does that mean? Well, my brain configuration would be all the state that my neurons were in before I fired that program. Okay, well, what state were my neurons in? Or more accurately, like, why were my neurons in whatever state they were in? At this point, we have to see that the state that my neurons were in was the state that was the result of the previous states. I had states that led to the next states. And each state is determined by a combination of external inputs being processed as well as internal calculations finishing. So there were external inputs happening. I saw the lid out of the corner of my eye. I was talking about something that required, or at least gave me the opportunity for me to use an illustration, an example. And so there was an input there saying, some calculation in my brain saying, hey, an example would be useful right now. Another part of my brain was going, hey, there is something out of the corner of your eye, could be used, connect the dots for example. And I looked down and my hand then was like, yeah, I'm close by. I could do what you want. And I'm like, trigger, run program, free will. But why was I talking to you in the first place to get to a point where I needed an example? Oh, I decided, apparently with free will, to do a podcast today about free will. But wait a minute. I actually decided to do a podcast about free will because free will came up in the conversation on YouTube because I mentioned it on another podcast I did. Why did I mention free will on that other podcast? Well, in that case, it was because my friend Kirk had said something and I was commenting about it. So I was reacting to what he had said. Not only that, I was amalgamating ideas that I had heard from Sam Harris and other philosophers and thinkers and many things I've read and thought about throughout the years, putting it together into a thought right then, triggered by what Kirk was saying. Well, why was I even recording the podcast that day? Well, Kirk had asked me to, but why did he ask me to? Well, 12 years ago, we decided to start doing podcasting. Why did that? Because do you see what's happening? Is that this isn't an isolated incident, not by the longest possible shot. We are here, and the set of circumstances is such only because a long unbroken chain of prior inputs and outputs. So, one angle of this could be that, well, wait a minute, then I probably wasn't making a free choice in that moment because all those inputs weren't decided in the moment. They were already there. So then the question becomes, okay, given the same set of the state, the same set of inputs, the same configuration of my brain, right before I ran that program to pick up the lid, given that same state more than one time, could I have made a different decision? Okay, so again, given the same exact configuration of my brain, all my neurons, and all the environment and everything, and we were to run that simulation again twice, 3 times, 4 times, would it always 100% of the time result in the same decision? Or would it vary sometimes? So if it varies sometimes, it would indicate that actually there's something in addition to the pre-configuration that is making that decision. Now, someone in the comments pointed out the other day, well, quantum physics has randomness to it. Like you can't determine the exact position and momentum. There is this random distribution at the quantum level. And it gets even spookier than that, because when you go past the quantum level to the molecular level, we've even observed such, aspect of reality, that things are apparently non-deterministic, that they are operating on a probability curve. So then we could say, well, then that brain configuration isn't deterministic, because the next time you roll tape, there's some probability distribution that will lead to different results randomly. That puts us back in the random number generator camp, which then I would say is not what we mean by free will, because it's not possible to know, even to us, what the heck we would do. And it's the result of intangible little random number generators running in our head. The exercise I encourage you to do at this point, you can even pause and try this, is pick something up. Pick a pencil, whatever you want. Pick it, hold it in front of your head. Now, as you do that, make a decision to either shake the object. Again, it doesn't have to be a pencil. It could be a lid. It could be whatever. Make a decision to either shake the object or not shake the object. And I'm not talking about small perturbances like that your hand is a little shaking. So I mean, really shake it or not try to shake it. Just make that decision. But right before you make the decision and after, consider where was the decision made? What part of your brain? What did it feel like to make that decision? So I'm going to try it right now. I'm here and I'm going to not shake it. I can't tell you, I honestly cannot tell you how I made the decision not to shake it. It's just a decision I made. But I can't tell you where the calculation happened. I don't think any of us can. And again, why you were even holding up a thing is because I told you to do it. You paused the video, you tried it, if you tried it. You might have decided not to pause the video. Why? Is that boring to you to do? Or do you resist authority? Or were you just getting the point of what I was getting at? You didn't need to do it yourself. And this is where, Sam Harris, for example, examines how if you try to move backward from a decision, it's sort of impossible to pinpoint why the decision actually happened. So you think, well, I made the choice. But where? How? Now, again, you can be perfectly happy to stop at this point and say, it does not matter. I felt like I made a choice. And, that's good. I have choice in this world. And so I have free will. And it does feel practically day to day feels like that's the case. We can decide to buy that car or cross the road or wait for another light turn or whatever, it certainly seems like we operate as if we have free will. And our laws and our relationships with others do, because we hold people accountable. But under closer scrutiny, what we think we mean by free will, that we're somehow independent from the variables of the universe, from our past, from those around us, that falls over under even in initial scrutiny. So many folks, myself included, have concluded that the thing we fantasize about, the true free will, is just a word like the word infinity. It's a word we have, or a phrase, a term we have coined as humans. But notice, not just because we have terms for things, words for things, doesn't guarantee that they are real. For example, a purple dragon with gray scales and that breathes sulfuric acid and has a tail that splits into 16 parts. I can imagine it, I can draw it, but that dragon doesn't really exist that I know of. But we could do this ad infinitum, right? Like, there are so many things we could describe, name, whatever, that don't actually exist. So just because we have this term free will doesn't mean that that is a real thing. Now, once again, I am not saying that we don't have practical day-to-day semblance of free will that's useful and that we should use in determining how we behave ourselves, how we draw laws, all these things. But it is not provable for sure. And it is almost certainly a conclusion we have to draw that in the universe as we detect it, where it seems to be like every moment is preceded by previous moments, and that the state from the previous moment to the next is either randomly determined or completely predetermined by the state, neither of those leave room for true free will, which is fascinating. And it can be freeing. Again, Sam Harris makes this argument where it can really free our mind when it comes to how we think about punishment and crimes and how we think about being punitive. Because if we actually consider that even the worst crimes, the worst criminals, the worst among us, when they're operating, they are following programs and they're the product of their environment. Look, we still have to hold them accountable. We still have to remove them from society as needed because practically we have to exist. We have to survive. We have to be able to get along. But maybe we don't have to be angry and burn people at the stake and point fingers in their faces. I mean, it feels good to do that sometimes, like, oh, you're such a bad monster. You did that. And, if it affects you or your family directly when some of these monsters do those things, I mean, I'm certainly not going to stand in your way from your fury and your anger. But it does, the more you think about it, the more it seems like, wow, we're all just creatures in this universe following along a certain track. And it may not be predetermined because there could be too much randomness for things to be predetermined. That's definitely where I land, is I think that because of the quantum probabilistic variance, it adds up to a non-deterministic future. And that's okay, and it's great. It's great if that's true. But whether it is or it isn't, we are still beholden as humans to all our inputs from the moment we're brought into existence and before, because we didn't get to choose the past of the universe. So maybe keeping that in mind can help us have more empathy for each other. Certainly in the transgressions that are not that serious, but maybe even beyond that. And it might lead, if more of us could embrace that, it could mean that we could have a more realistic crime and punishment system. Realistic in that, maybe we could be aware that putting someone punitively in a cell, although it might feel right, and certainly removing them from society when they're trying to harm society is a necessity. It may not help them or even society if you then release them because they might have been damaged worse by that, and maybe our anger towards them was misplaced, and there's room for thought there. I don't have the right answer for it. There are other countries that have different systems of crime and punishment. Some of it seems to go too far sometimes, but whatever. The point is, I think it would behoove us as humans to do some meditating, some thinking on this aspect of what is truly freedom, what is free will, And how does it relate to how we interact with each other and what expectations we have and how much empathy we have? And that's it. I'm freely choosing to end here. Goodbye.